Her reserves were completely exhausted. However, upon discovering the injured fighter losing blood onto the ground, Mercy Whitmore offered her final water drops to his parched mouth. Come evening, 700 war-painted warriors would encircle her dwelling, and her solitary gesture of compassion would determine whether she lived or perished. The dawn light had just begun to appear over the ridges when Mercy emerged from her worn cabin, clutching the timber pail that contained her only valuable liquid possession. Her water source had dried up 3 days prior, and this cloudy, tepid water represented the sole barrier between herself and the treacherous journey to the stream through lands where individuals vanished without trace. Her unshod feet stepped cautiously over the stone-covered terrain as she inspected the rabbit traps her father had shown her how to construct before illness claimed his life. Empty once more, her belly cramped with the familiar ache of starvation, though she'd mastered the art of dismissing that specific agony. At 16 years old, she'd survived alone for 8 months, transforming daily existence into ongoing bargaining with hope. That moment arrived when she spotted him. The warrior lay prone near her property's boundary, his black hair clotted with gore, one limb bent unnaturally. Battle paint marked his torso in designs she couldn't identify, and a knife with carved bone grip rested just out of his grasp. Every aspect of his appearance declared peril, the variety of peril her fellow settlers murmured about beside their hearths, the sort that compelled full-grown men to inspect their firearms twice before resting. Yet as Mercy drew nearer, she observed something that constricted her chest. His respiration arrived in brief, frantic pants. Gore flowed from a gash in his flank, darkening the soil beneath him crimson. His mouth was split and pale, his flesh fevering. Death approached him. Wisdom dictated retreat, to act as though she'd never witnessed him, to allow fate to proceed and sidestep the troubles that aiding him would certainly invite. Her father had constantly cautioned her regarding the mounting conflicts between colonists and native peoples, about how a single misstep could ignite bloodshed that would devour everything nearby. However, Mercy had never possessed particular wisdom in such matters. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she lifted his head gently. His eyes opened, black and intense despite their frailty. For an instant, they gazed at each other across a chasm that had destroyed numerous lives. She anticipated his withdrawal, his reach for the blade, his perception of her as the foe. Instead, his stare locked onto the container in her grasp. Without pause, Mercy pressed the water to his mouth. Drop by valuable drop, she allowed it to trickle past his lips, observing his throat's effort to swallow. She expended nearly half her remaining supply, sufficient water for 2 days with rationing, enough to sustain her until she could attempt the perilous trek to the stream. After he consumed enough, she ripped pieces from her already tattered gown to cleanse his injuries. The cut in his side ran deep, though not mortally so with proper care. During her ministrations, she noticed something that chilled her core, a unique mark on his shoulder resembling a lightning strike. Around his throat hung a pendant bearing markings that identified him as significant, someone whose disappearance would draw attention. The fighter's gaze remained fixed on her features as she wrapped his wounds with her last clean fabric. Upon completion, he lifted his uninjured arm and briefly touched her hand. Not threatening, but something resembling appreciation. His eyes then shut, and his breathing settled into the steady pattern of restorative rest. Mercy leaned back, suddenly conscious of her actions. She'd just preserved the life of someone whose tribe war with her own. She'd sacrificed her final water, her final bandages, her final margins of safety on someone who might awaken and slay her. Someone whose mere presence on her land could be interpreted as warfare by any colonist who discovered him. Yet as she gazed upon his tranquil expression, she experienced something absent for months, the comforting warmth of having performed something purely righteous in a world seemingly intent on punishing virtue at every opportunity. That sensation endured precisely as long as required for her to detect the sound that paralyzed her blood. Hoofbeats, numerous ones approaching rapidly across the valley bottom. From their rhythm, she could determine they weren't the mounts of settlers or military. These belonged to fighters, and they advanced directly toward her dwelling. Mercy's pulse pounded against her chest as the thunder of hooves intensified. She glanced down at the unconscious fighter. Akachita. She'd heard him murmur the name when she'd offered him water. then toward her cabin 20 yards distant. She'd never reach it in time to conceal him. Even if possible, the blood traces would betray him. Logic suggested flight, vanishing into the forest behind her home, allowing whatever approached to discover what they would. Yet something within her rejected abandoning the person she'd just rescued. If these riders intended him harm, her presence might represent the sole barrier between him and death. The initial warrior appeared over the ridge like something from nightmares. His mount moved with the graceful fluidity of wind over water, while the rider himself appeared carved from granite and rage. Battle paint covered his features in dramatic sweeps of crimson and ebony, with feathers streaming from his hair as he rode. Behind him emerged another, then another, until the hillside seemed to flow with mounted figures. 10 fighters, 20, 50. Mercy had never witnessed so many gathered, had never conceived such a sight possible. They moved with flawless coordination, dispersing to encircle her land like water surrounding a boulder. Their horses snorted and pawed, but the riders sat motionless as death, their eyes examining every portion of her territory. The lead fighter, a man whose bearing demanded respect even from afar, lifted his hand, causing the entire warband to halt as one. His attention found Mercy instantly, kneeling beside Akecheta with blood staining her hands and terror marking her features. For an extended moment, no one stirred. Mercy sensed the burden of countless gazes, each calculating her danger level, her motives, her survival prospects. She could detect the horse's scent, hear leather creaking and wind whispering through feathers. The morning atmosphere hummed with tension, so dense it felt tangible. Then the lead warrior dismounted. He appeared older than the rest, with silver threading his lengthy hair and battle scars mapping his arms like chronicles of survived conflicts. When he moved, the earth seemed to recognize his authority. This was someone accustomed to obedience, to having his words treated as absolute law. Behind him, the remaining warriors stayed mounted but prepared, their hands positioned on weapons capable of ending her existence instantly. As he advanced, Mercy observed something that intensified her stomach's anxiety. The lightning bolt scar on his shoulder matched Akecheta's exactly, and how his eyes focused on the unconscious warrior revealed everything about their connection. This wasn't merely a war party seeking a missing fighter. This was a father searching for his child. The chief halted 3 feet from her, close enough for her to observe the anguish behind his fierce demeanor. His gaze traveled from Akecheta's wrapped wounds to the empty container beside Mercy to the torn fabric pieces from her dress now serving as bandages. When he returned his attention to her face, she glimpsed something unexpected. Bewilderment. He spoke then, his voice carrying thunder's authority. Words in an unfamiliar language whose intent seemed sufficiently clear. An inquiry, a demand for explanation. But before Mercy could attempt any response, something altered in their surrounding atmosphere. Additional hoofbeats approaching from the opposing direction. The warriors tensed immediately, hands reaching for weapons, horses stepping nervously. These new riders lacked war paint. They wore cavalry blue uniforms and approached at speed. The chief's head jerked toward the approaching cavalry sound. In that instant, Mercy witnessed the situation explode beyond her control. The warriors behind him shifted, like birds sensing predators. Weapons materialized in hands with lethal precision. What had been tense but manageable was becoming a slaughter with her trapped between. "Stop," she whispered, then louder. "Stop." She flung herself across Akecheta's unconscious body, extending her arms wide as though her small frame could somehow protect him from what approached. The chief's eyes expanded at her gesture, genuine shock crossing his weathered features. Throughout his years of combat, he'd clearly never witnessed a colonist willing to perish defending one of his people. The cavalry burst in the tree line like a blue wave of trouble. 12 soldiers commanded by a lieutenant whose inexperienced face revealed someone still believing warfare could remain clean and straightforward. Upon seeing the war party surrounding Mercy's cabin, his hand immediately went to his sword. "Surrender!" he yelled, his voice breaking slightly on the order. "Free the woman and retreat from this region." The chief turned slowly, his movement intentional and threatening. When he spoke, his English carried a heavy accent but perfect clarity. "We claim what belongs to us. That woman is under United States Army protection." The lieutenant responded, though Mercy noticed his trembling weapon hand. Any violence against it will be treated as warfare. A frigid smile touched the chief's mouth. War. He gestured toward his fighters, who seemed to multiply in the morning brightness as additional ones emerged from positions Mercy hadn't realized they held. You bring 12 boys to discuss war. The lieutenant's complexion paled as he grasped what Mercy was beginning to comprehend. This wasn't coincidental. The war party hadn't accidentally discovered Akachita here. They'd been following him, pursuing a path that led straight to her entrance. Now they confronted exactly the type of confrontation that sparked the conflict her father had warned about. There's been confusion, Mercy announced, her voice stronger than her feelings. Both groups turned toward her, and she realized she might be the only person present who didn't desire gunfire. I assisted him. He was injured, and I provided water. You what? The lieutenant's voice rose higher. You aided a hostile warrior. He was perishing, she stated simply. The chief examined her expression intensely, as though attempting to decipher something written there in a language he was learning to understand. He spoke again in his native tongue, a rapid series of words that caused several warriors to murmur among themselves. Then he observed Akachita, noting how carefully his wounds had been treated. The clean water container, the cloth strips clearly taken from the woman's own garments. Before anyone could respond to this discovery, Akachita's eyes opened. The young fighter's gaze moved from his father's face to the soldiers behind him, to Mercy still positioned protectively beside him. When he attempted to rise, pain made him gasp, but he forced himself upright regardless. He addressed his father in urgent whispers, gesturing toward Mercy with his functioning arm. The chief's expression transformed as he listened to his son's words. The harsh lines around his eyes relaxed slightly, and when he regarded Mercy again, something different appeared in his gaze. Something resembling respect. My son claims you granted him life, the chief said slowly. Claims you sacrificed your final water when you possessed nothing. Anyone would have acted similarly, Mercy responded, though everyone knew that wasn't accurate. The lieutenant, increasingly frustrated by this conversation beyond his control, stepped forward. I don't care about her actions. She's a colonist under military protection, and I'm commanding you to... The chief's hand reached his tomahawk so rapidly it appeared magical. You command nothing here, youth. The morning atmosphere sparked with violence about to erupt. Weapons emerged on both sides, horses snorting and shifting, men's expressions settling into grim masks worn before killing commenced. At the center of everything, Mercy understood that her singular act of kindness had created a tangle that might only unravel through bloodshed. The tension stretched like a bowstring nearing its breaking point. Mercy could observe fingers gripping triggers, hands shifting to weapon handles, horses sensing their riders' readiness for battle. Within seconds, her small plot would become a battlefield, and everyone present seemed prepared to die for principles she didn't completely grasp. Except Akachita. The wounded fighter struggled upright, wavering slightly, but refusing his father's supporting hand. When he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with surprising force, each word deliberately chosen in English for universal comprehension. She is under my protection now. The declaration struck like lightning. The lieutenant's mouth fell open. Several warriors shifted uneasily. Even the chief appeared taken aback by his son's pronouncement. In Lakota culture, such a statement carried legal weight, binding the speaker to defend the protected individual with his life. You cannot do that, the lieutenant stammered. She's a citizen of... She granted me life when she could have allowed my death, Akachita continued, completely ignoring the soldier, his attention fixed on his father. The spirits guided me to her entrance for a purpose. She has earned the privilege to move safely among our people. The chief's expression remained unreadable, but Mercy could observe the internal conflict behind his eyes. This was his child, heir to their band's leadership, making a choice that could impact the delicate power balance throughout the entire region. But it was also a choice grounded in honor, in ancient customs that demanded debts be settled. And regarding them, the chief indicated the cavalry. They will not comprehend our customs. At that moment, Mercy made a choice that astonished everyone, herself included. She rose slowly, positioning herself between both groups, and spoke with clarity that cut to the morning atmosphere. I choose to accompany them. Every eye focused on her. The lieutenant appeared horrified. Several warriors whispered among themselves, but Akachita smiled faintly as though he'd anticipated exactly this reaction. "Miss, you cannot seriously be contemplating," the lieutenant began. "I am," Mercy stated firmly. "I assisted Akachita because it was correct. If that means answering to his people, then that's my path." She looked directly at the chief. "But I won't become the cause of death today. If my departure with you prevents violence, then that's where I belong." The chief studied her extensively, his weathered features revealing nothing. Around them, warriors awaited his decision, while cavalry members fidgeted nervously in their saddles. The morning sun rose higher, creating sharp shadows that seemed to separate the world into distinct areas of brightness and darkness. Finally, the chief spoke. "You would entrust your existence to people you've been taught to dread. I would entrust my existence to people who comprehend honor," Mercy responded. "Your son could have slain me when I helped him. Instead, he offered safety. That reveals everything about your people." The lieutenant made one final desperate effort. "I cannot permit a civilian to depart with a hostile war party. My orders—" "Your orders?" the chief interrupted, his voice carrying Winter's finality. "Hold no meaning here." He turned to Mercy, and for the first time, something resembling respect appeared in his eyes. "If you come voluntarily, you will receive honorable treatment. But understand this. Once you enter our territory, return to this world may be impossible." Mercy felt the decision's weight settling on her shoulders. Behind her lay everything familiar. Her cabin, her land, the existence she constructed from her family's shattered dreams. Ahead lay the unknown, a people whose customs she didn't understand, and the real possibility that she might never witness another dawn. But as she observed Akachita, still unsteady on his feet, but standing proudly despite his injuries, she realized something surprising. For the first time in months, solitude had ended. The chief raised his hand, and one warrior brought forward a decorated horse, its coat shining in the morning sunlight. The creature was magnificent, clearly bred for velocity and stamina, with intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate Mercy as thoroughly as its rider did. "You will ride with dignity," the chief said, assisting her mount. His hands were surprisingly tender, and she glimpsed something fatherly in his demeanor. "My name is Tatanka. You preserved my son's life. That obligation will not be overlooked." As Mercy settled onto the horse's back, she heard the lieutenant calling behind them. "This is an error. When news reaches Fort Collins, there will be repercussions. The army will search for her." Tatanka turned in his saddle, his voice carrying absolute certainty's weight. "Let them come. They will discover only what the wind reveals." The war party began moving, flowing like water around Mercy's position. She found herself encircled but not imprisoned, guarded rather than seized. Akachita rode alongside her despite his wounds, his presence steady and comforting in a world that had suddenly become entirely alien. As they topped the first ridge, Mercy glanced back to see her cabin shrinking in the distance. The lieutenant and his men remained where she'd left them, their blue uniforms vivid against the brown soil. She wondered whether she'd ever see that small house again, ever rest in the bed her father had constructed with his own hands. But then Akachita spoke quietly beside her. "You demonstrated great bravery there. Few would have chosen as you did." "I lacked real alternatives," she replied. "Not if I wanted to live with myself later." He nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "My father will want to learn more about you. Why you aided me, why you chose to accompany us rather than seek the soldiers' protection." Mercy pondered this as they rode deeper into territory she'd never explored. The landscape possessed harsh beauty, rolling hills and scattered trees with mountains rising in the distance like the world's spine. She'd always considered this vacant land dangerous and untamed, but viewing it through her warrior escort's eyes, she began understanding it was far from vacant. It was home. "What should I tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Akachita said simply. "My people prize honesty above everything. If you speak from your heart, he will understand." They traveled in comfortable silence, while horses maintained the easy rhythm of animals bred for long journeys. Around them, warriors maintained alert vigilance, but something had changed. In their manner, they no longer viewed her as a potential threat, but rather as someone under their care. If you were Mercy, would you trust these strangers with your existence, risking everything for honor? Or would you have attempted to escape back to the familiar world of colonists and soldiers? Share your thoughts in the comments. I need to understand which side you'd select, because what Mercy discovered at their destination would challenge everything she believed about courage, loyalty, and what truly means belonging somewhere. Midday arrived when they reached the tribal land's edge, and Mercy's breath stopped. Spread across the valley below was a sight no colonist had ever survived to describe, a vast encampment that seemed to extend to the horizon. Hundreds of lodges dotted the landscape like enormous blossoms, smoke rising from countless fires. The sound reaching her ears was unlike anything she'd experienced. Children's voices at play, women's songs, dogs barking, horses whinnying. It was the sound of a living, breathing community. 700 warriors, Tatanka said, noting her expression, and their families, nearly 3,000 people who called this place home. Mercy felt her mouth dry. She'd heard tribal population estimates from traders and soldiers, but witnessing reality was entirely different. This wasn't the small, scattered group she'd imagined. This was a nation. Do they all know about me? She asked. Akachita's smile was mysterious. Information travels quickly here. By now, everyone knows a colonist girl offered her final water to preserve a warrior's life. They're curious to meet someone bold enough or foolish enough to make such a choice. As they began descending into the valley, Mercy realized her true test was beginning. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The morning's confrontation with the cavalry seemed simple compared to what awaited, earning the trust and respect of 3,000 people who had every reason to consider her their enemy. The procession into camp was beyond anything Mercy could have conceived. As news spread of their arrival, people emerged from their lodges like flowers responding to sunlight. Children ran beside the horses, their laughter bright and inquisitive. Women paused their work to observe, some with suspicion, others with open interest. Warriors nodded respectfully to Tatanka, but their eyes remained on the pale girl riding beside his wounded son. Mercy felt the burden of hundreds of gazes, each carrying questions she couldn't answer. Her worn dress, mended and faded, seemed shabby compared to the beautifully adorned clothing surrounding her. The elaborate beadwork, the rich colors of painted hides, the elegant hair braiding decorated with feathers and shells. It was artistry that made her feel like a sparrow among eagles. But what impressed her most was something unexpected. The children. They appeared just like children everywhere. Curious, playful, full of life. Some lingered shyly behind their mother's skirts, while others boldly reached to touch her horse as they passed. Their laughter was universal, requiring no translation. Tatanka led them to the camp center, where the largest lodge stood, decorated with symbols that seemed to narrate stories in a language of paint and hide. As they dismounted, an elderly woman emerged from this central dwelling. Her hair was silver white, braided with ornaments that captured light, and her face held wisdom that came from witnessing many seasons pass. When she looked at Mercy, the girl felt as though she was being measured for something far more significant than clothing. This is Winona, Tatanka said. She preserves our stories, remembers what must not be forgotten. She will determine if your actions have earned you a place among us. Winona approached slowly, her gaze never leaving Mercy's face. When she spoke, her English was precise and deliberate, as though each word had been selected for its exact importance. You offered water to my grandson when you possessed little for yourself. Yes, Mercy replied simply. You knew he was Lakota. You understood the danger. Yes, yet you chose to assist him regardless. Mercy nodded, uncertain what else to say. The old woman continued studying her, and the entire camp seemed to pause, awaiting her judgment. Finally, Winona smiled, an expression that transformed her weathered features into something beautiful. Then you understand something many do not, that compassion recognizes no borders, that mercy knows no tribe. She stepped forward and placed her hands on Mercy's shoulders. You will rest in my lodge tonight. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, you will choose. Return to your people with our blessing and protection, or remain here and learn our ways. But know this, whatever you choose, you will always be welcome at our fires. The crowd around them began dispersing. People returned to daily tasks, but with new energy, a buzz of conversation about the day's unprecedented events. Mercy felt relief mixed with overwhelming uncertainty. She'd been accepted, at least temporarily, but the weight of the coming choice pressed down like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. As Winona led her toward the lodge, Mercy glimpsed Akecheta being assisted away by two other warriors. Before he disappeared from view, he turned back and met her eye. His nod was subtle but unmistakable, a promise that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mercy couldn't dismiss the feeling that something was building on the horizon, something that would test not just her courage, but the fragile piece her act of kindness had created. The lodge was more spacious inside than it appeared externally, with buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles, creating space that felt both intimate and grand. Painted symbols covered the walls, animals' heavenly bodies, and geometric patterns that seemed to dance in the flickering central fire's light. Winona moved with practiced efficiency, preparing food and bedding while sharing stories that helped Mercy understand the world she'd entered. "My people have inhabited this land for generations beyond counting," the old woman said as she worked. "We know every stream, every hunting ground, every sacred place. But recently, more colonists arrive each season, and with them, soldiers who see only vacant land to be claimed." Mercy listened, beginning to understand the deeper currents that had brought her to this moment. Her own family had been part of that westward movement, seeking opportunity in a place others already called home. The realization brought a complicated mixture of guilt and comprehension. "Your son Akecheta, he was scouting near colonist territory when wounded?" she asked. Winona's hands paused in their work. "He was returning from a peace mission. Some of our young warriors grow restless, speak of expelling all colonists before more arrive. Akecheta went to speak with neighboring band chiefs to urge patience, to seek a path that doesn't lead to war." The weight of this revelation settled over Mercy like a blanket. She'd saved a peacemaker's life, someone working to prevent the very conflicts that terrified colonists like herself. But she'd also learned something else. War was closer than she'd realized, balanced on a knife's edge that could tip either direction. As evening deepened, the camp sound began changing. Children's laughter gave way to adults' low conversations, fire crackling, and something else, a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to pulse with the earth's own heartbeat. They were recounting today's events. Winona explained, seeing Mercy's curious expression. "Your story. How a colonist girl chose compassion over fear. How she rode willingly into danger rather than witness bloodshed. Such stories become part of our history, passed through generations." Mercy felt overwhelmed by the thought. "I simply did what anyone should do. But few would," Winona replied gently. "That's what makes it worth remembering." As they prepared for sleep, outside commotion caught their attention. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and through the lodge's entrance, Mercy could see warriors gathering around fires, their faces grim in the dancing light. "What's occurring?" she asked. Before Winona could answer, Tatanka's voice called from outside. "Winona, bring the girl. She needs to hear this." They emerged to find the chief standing with several other warriors, all wearing expressions that made Mercy's stomach clench with dread. When Tatanka spoke, his words carried an approaching storm's weight. "Riders came from the east. The lieutenant who wanted to take you back has returned to Fort Collins and told his commander that we captured a colonist woman. They're calling it warfare." Mercy felt blood draining from her face. "But I came willingly. I chose to come here." "They don't care about choice," another warrior said bitterly. "They see only what serves their purpose, a reason to bring soldiers into our lands." Tatanka continued, his voice heavy with leadership's burden. "They're gathering forces, not just from Fort Collins, but from 3 other military posts. By tomorrow's end, we could face 500 soldiers demanding your return." The implications washed over Mercy like a frigid wave. Her act of kindness, intended to prevent bloodshed, had instead provided the excuse for exactly the kind of large-scale conflict everyone had been trying to avoid. The young lieutenant's wounded pride had escalated a simple misunderstanding into potential massacre. "I must return," she said immediately. "I must tell them the truth." "It may be too late for truth," Winona said sadly. "When men desire war, they find ways to justify it. Akachita appeared at the firelight's edge, his wounds freshly dressed, but his steps still uncertain. "There's something more," he said grimly. "Our scouts report that some of our own young warriors are using this as a call to arms. They claim the time for peace has ended, that we should attack first before the soldiers can organize." Mercy realized with growing horror that she stood at the center of forces spiraling beyond anyone's control. Her single act of compassion had become the catalyst for exactly the kind of devastating conflict both sides had been dreading. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, armies were gathering that would arrive with dawn. Dawn broke gray and threatening, with storm clouds gathering on both horizons, literal ones in the sky and human ones on the plains. Mercy stood with Tatanka and his council, watching as dust clouds marked the cavalry's approach from the east, while war parties of young Lakota warriors assembled to the west. Between them lay a valley that would soon become a battlefield, unless someone found a way to step back from the brink. 500 soldiers, a scout reported breathlessly, led by a colonel who's never lost a battle. They bring cannons. And our young warriors number 300 with more arriving from allied bands. Another voice added. They paint their faces for war and sing death songs. Mercy felt impending catastrophes weight pressing on her shoulders. Everything she'd tried to prevent was about to happen on a scale that would echo through history. But as she watched the two forces converging, an idea began forming, desperate, dangerous, but perhaps their only hope. "Allow me to go to them," she said suddenly. "Alone before they meet." Tatanka shook his head immediately. "You will be killed before speaking 10 words. Soldiers in battle mood see only enemies. Now if I carry something they can't ignore," Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "A truce flag in proof that I was never captured." She turned to face the assembled council, her heart racing but her voice steady. "Give me Akachita and a small escort. Let us ride to the middle ground between the armies. When both sides see that he's alive and I'm unharmed, when they hear the truth of what really happened, maybe reason can still prevail. And if it doesn't," Winona asked quietly, "then at least we'll have tried something other than violence first." The next hour passed in preparation's blur. Akachita, still weak but determined, mounted his horse beside Mercy. 5 warriors rode with him, carrying white cloth that caught the morning wind like visible prayers as they crossed the valley floor toward the space between the armies. Mercy could feel hundreds of eyes watching their progress. The cavalry had formed battle lines, their blue uniforms stark against the brown earth, but when they saw the small party approaching under a truce flag, discipline held. Officers raised spyglasses, trying to understand what they were seeing. When they reached the midpoint, Mercy dismounted and walked forward alone. Her voice, when she called out, carried clearly across the valley. "I am Mercy Whitmore. I was never captured. I came here willingly to prevent bloodshed, and I'm here now for the same reason." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single rider broke from the cavalry lines. The young lieutenant from the previous day, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You were forced," he shouted, threatened into saying these things. "I was shown more kindness by these people than I've known in months," Mercy replied. "They fed me, sheltered me, and protected me. The only threat to my safety is the war you're about to start." The commanding colonel rode forward, his weathered face skeptical but listening. Behind him, Mercy could see soldiers murmuring among themselves, their certainty beginning to waver. Akachita joined her then, his presence living proof of her words. "I was dying when she found me," he called out in clear English. "She gave me her final water, her final food, her final bandages. She preserved my life when she could have let me perish." The colonel studied them both for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he began to smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Finally, a peace treaty negotiated by a girl who doesn't know when to mind her own business." 3 months later, Mercy stood in the doorway of a new cabin built where 3 territories met, a place where colonists, soldiers, and Lakota could trade safely under protection of the unprecedented agreement that had grown from that morning in the valley. Akachita, fully healed, worked beside her father-in-law, Tatanka, to establish the trading post that would serve as neutral ground for all peoples. The young lieutenant had been reassigned to a desk job back east, a fate he considered worse than death. The colonel had been promoted for his role in preventing a war, and Mercy had found something she'd never expected, a family that crossed all the boundaries people said couldn't be crossed. But most importantly, she learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change history's course, if you're brave enough to see them through to the end. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel now. Click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one. With courage so unexpected and an ending so powerful, it will stay with you long after the final word.